Hello, this is Harry Paden. I am the host of the Paden Perspective. This is season 2, episode 14, and the subject today will be the connection between Native American and the United States in regards to the U.S. Constitution. I'm not humble. I am a historian. I love historical facts and I never stop learning. I'm not one of those noted historians that have all the knowledge up here, but I have knowledge up here, but I also know where to look for it. I also seek knowledge every day. By that, I've come across, and I, was very fortunate to have such great teachers outside the school system, many of them, that taught me things that weren't taught in the conventional history books. Now, yesterday, we celebrated July 4th, which is called Independence Day. Now, because Juneteenth is celebrated, many people say that's not our, meaning people of color, Independence Day, because we weren't free, which is a fact, or considered free on the date that this nation declared its independence. Now, when I say declared, they declared that didn't mean that they were necessarily free. They had to fight a war. But okay, that's history you can learn in American school. But I also want you to know that America's independence was the first that was successfully executed in the Western Hemisphere. Hemisphere, globe, country, world. So in the Western Hemisphere, the United States, with their revolution in 1776, July 4th, was the first independent nation in the Western Hemisphere. Now, do you know who was the second nation and is the second oldest nation that gained its independence in the Western Hemisphere? If you don't know, you should know. And I don't care whether you're of color or whether you are not of color. It's the great country of Haiti, under the leadership of the revolutionary Toussaint Louverture, who defeated, many talk about the mighty Napoleon. Mighty? He definitely was, that's a fact. But he had a loss on his record because the French weren't able to keep the Haitians under their control. And it's a chapter in my book entitled Why Haiti is Hated by So Many Nations, especially the United States. Very interesting. And you really need to know that. You don't have to read my book. It's just, they hate Haiti. And it mainly has to do with the fact that Haiti was the first black country to gain their independence from that immoral slavery. Now, let me get on to the subject of today's subject. Now, we're going to talk about the United States Constitution, which came because as an independent nation, we had to gain our freedom, and then we had to govern ourselves. You can't just throw caution to the wind. So what happened was that we became free. And all of a sudden, we discovered, wait a minute, we got to have rules and regulations, and we didn't like the rules and regulations, which is the reason that we declared our independence from the mighty Great Britain. So here are some of the things that you should know. I always admired the U.S. Constitution. I thought it was a well-written document. The unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yes, we know that they didn't include black people at the time. The framers, many of them had slaves. We know, well, most of us know that, those of us that have, gone beyond America's history. But our history books also taught us that Christopher Columbus, no offense to my Italian friends or the great Italian people, but he got lost. And he came to America thinking that he was in India. So he saw some people here and he called them Indians because he thought he was in India. Two big mistakes, not necessarily highlighted in our history, but nowadays there's a lot of brouhaha about that holiday, Columbus Day. But thank God for Columbus, because if he didn't make that mistake, mistakes can sometimes benefit people. If he didn't get lost, many of us might not be here in this country. I don't know where I would be. I'll probably be born and maybe else, some will say maybe you'll be born. I don't know, but I'm here now. Thank you, Christopher Columbus, for getting lost and discovering a country that was already inhabited. But it taught us that when he came here, that the people he discovered were savages. They cut off people's scalp and they ran around and barely could feed themselves, and that's the stuff that they taught us. Well, I consider myself a revisionist. I now tell the truth. Revisionist historian. And in that matter, I have a doctor in revisionist history. Not a school's doctorate, but I have a doctorate from knowledge. I challenge people all the time because what I know that I know, and I have it from great sources. Well, the U.S. Constitution, the great document that for many years I admired. I honestly admired it. Wow, they were such intelligent people. Well, here's a bit of fact that I didn't know until one day I discovered. Again, I read a lot. I ferret out information a lot. The United States Constitution owes its notion, its idea of democracy to the Iroquois tribes. This includes freedom of speech, religion, separation of powers in the government, and the only difference between the Iroquois Constitution, which was established a long time before the U.S. Constitution, I'll give you the date, the only difference is that the Iroquois Constitution included women and non-white. So it seems their constitution was more beneficial to people like me and any of you who happen to be female. Interesting, right? I know by now some of you are like Gary Coleman. What you talking about, Paden? Well, let me give you some of the history and some of the facts that I've come across. The Iroquois Confederacy, that's what it was called, was founded by the great peacemaker in the year 1142. And it is one of the oldest living, which means it's continuing, participatory democracy on earth. At the time that this document, the Iroquois put together, was put together, at the time, the nations of the Iroquois had been entangled in a continuous intertribal conflicts between the various Indian tribes. Now, did you know there were over 5,000 people, Indians, living in societies, not tribes, not teepees. Yes, they lived in teepees and stuff like that. That's one aspect of one tribe. But they had houses, they had societies, they had ruling governments. 5,000 people that this man discovered. So they were involved in a lot of different wars, and wars can become tiring because it weakens you. You know, you see brothers die, you see family members die, you see property destroyed, and it weakens their society. So the great peacemaker, the wise Hiawatha, chief of, let me try to pronounce this, Anudenda. Probably messed it up. I thought I practiced it. Tribe, but they traveled to each of the 5 nations. So they went to each of the 5 nations. The great wise Hiawatha. We did study him somewhat, and they wanted to share their ideas for peace. And what they did is they got together and they convened a council meeting. And Hiawatha presented what was called, or still is named, the Law of Peace. It united the 5 nations into a League of Nations. United Nations, League of Nations. See, the Indians were wise before we came and stole a lot of their ideas. They had a League of Nations. Sound familiar? United Nations? Well, it united the 5 nations into a League of Nations, and it also goes by the name of the Iroquois Confederacy. And it became the basis for the Iroquois Confederacy Constitution. Each nation, each of those 5 nations, maintained its own leadership, but they all agreed that certain common causes would be decided by the Grand Council of Chiefs, similar to what goes on in Washington, except they don't decide anything. They fight, and if it's Democrat, they don't want it, and if it's Republican. Crazy, right? Crazy. But anyway, this concept, their concept, the Indians' concept, who really, they're Native Americans, which means they were here before anyone, the Native Americans. The Native American concept was based on peace and consensus rather than fighting. That's the great Iroquois people. And this is 4 centuries ago. The nations of the, I'm going to pronounce it, excuse me if I mispronounce that. I did look it up, so I'm going to try to pronounce it. Haudenosaunee, that's one of them, the Iroquois. They united into a confederacy. And this confederacy united the 5 nations. The Mohawk, the Seneca, I have problems with this one for some reason. Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Cayuga, and eventually the Tuscarora people. And it became the predominant Native American tribe in the northeastern prior to the arrival of the Europeans. So again, they had a ruling system, powerful, that united 5 nations prior to the colonists coming over and discovering them. And what happened was their governing system actually took on a life of its own, because the framers of our Constitution seen how well the Indian societies were run, decided they sit down with some of the Indian leaders and say, how do you rule yourselves? How do you govern yourselves? How do you keep peace? And they saw that the Indians were a very united country. They gave the colonists the fight of their lives trying to keep them from doing what they eventually ended up doing. Owen, O-R-E-N, Lyons, he was a faith keeper for the Iroquois Confederation. He went to the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs, and he brought up this subject. He went to Washington and testified before the Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs, and he told them what had happened, how the Native American Constitution was the basis for our Constitution because no one knew, wasn't taught, it was a hidden secret. And this motivated the committee's chair, Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, and he helped Congress to pass a 1988 resolution that formally acknowledged the influence of the Iroquois Confederacy on the U.S. Constitution. In addition to this, it recognized and affirmed the government-to-government relationship between the Indian tribes and the United States established in the Constitution. And it says it was an acknowledgement of the legitimacy and sovereignty of the native nations and their governments. So that's part of now our Constitution. It is recorded, it is now acknowledged, it is not taught in the schools, but it is now part of our history and it is there. You can certainly go, and I'll give you the facts of it. So the system of unified governance was drafted after the Native Americans, and here's what it says. In 1987, the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Senate passed the resolution I was just talking about. And it says, the Constitution of the original 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy. Let me read that to you again, because this is a matter of history recorded by the U.S. Senate. And I'm sure some of them that are currently serving may not acknowledge it, but back in 1987, those who were senators did. 1987, the bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution saying, and I quote, the Confederation of the original 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy, as were many of the democratic principles which were incorporated into the Constitution itself. This Senate resolution, you can feel free to look it up, hopefully you have a pen, H. Congress Resolution 331, and it was passed in October of 1988. It reads, whereas the Confederation of the original 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy, as were many of the democratic principles which were incorporated into the Constitution itself. And it goes on. Of course, there are some historians that, will challenge this, but this is a living document. H, the letter H, and then Congress Resolution 331. Just put H dot Congress Resolution 331, and you'll find this information. Very good information to have. And back when this was established with the Native Americans, this brought them together and it unified them and made them a very strong power. These five nations were able to rule over the many because there were more than just five nations, but these were the five strongest nations and they were constantly battling to see who would be number one. But this Constitution kind of gave them the premise, as in our U.S. Constitution, to say we can agree to disagree, but let's be strong as one body. Because if the United States is not strong as one body, Russia, China, other places will certainly take us and make us their people. So you have to now know that the Constitution, as great as it was influenced by the Native Americans. The people that we were taught were savages. The people that we were taught that we came over here and discovered because we had to help them. Huh. Know your history. The best way to know your history is to ferret it out. By that I mean, no one's going to give you your history. And sometimes I get annoyed, well, all the time I get annoyed when I hear people, why didn't they teach us that in school? Come on, people. Sorry. You know how I go. Woosah. They're not going to teach you what could benefit you. They, meaning the powers that be. So we get it clear. Those who have the power. The people with the money, because money is what rules not only this country, but it rules the world. So the Native American model of governance is fair, and it always meets the needs of the people when used right. The Iroquois people were some wise people. And we, people of color, can use a lot of their concepts. A lot of their concepts are common to the people of Africa, but remember, we know that our history was stolen, so we have a disconnect. But if you study, many of the great African nations had a concept just like the Iroquois nations. And they had that you always make sure that you supply the needs to reach 7 generations. So in other words, what we do today, you want it to benefit 7 generations. So your children, your children's children, your children's children's children, all the way to 7 generations. The 7th generation principle dictate that decisions that are made today should lead to sustainability for 7 generations. And if you say it again, Paden, the 7th generation principle dictate that decisions that are made today should lead to sustainability for 7 generations of the future. Certainly that is a concept that is awesome. Because I don't know about you, but I want 7 generations of my family to benefit from what I do today. And the indigenous nations in North America were and are organized, or the most organized by democratic principles, and they focus on the creation of strong kinship bonds that promote leadership. See, again, that's something that annoys me. America doesn't seem to get it that black people are leaders too. So they don't want black people to be educated. But look at the great leaders who are black in the past, under slavery, under the oppression, Jim Crow and all that. We still have some of the greatest minds. So imagine if you gave those minds the same education that you think is exclusive to people who are pink. Preach, brother, preach. But the Indians, great people, they knew that you have to train leadership. Leadership shouldn't always be your brother, sister, and cousin who can't get a job. Preach. Okay? Preach. Another concept that they have, and it's common to a lot of cultures. I do know them. I won't start mentioning them, but it was a great honor to give, back then, horses were a commodity, to give your horses to the poorest members of the tribe. And this is still practiced by many in the Native American societies today. And it is a voluntary redistribution of wealth to those who have the least. America has 13, 14, whatever it is, rich people with so much money they'll never spend it in their lifetime, in 7 generations' lifetime. But many of them wouldn't distribute or redistribute a penny to help a poor person around the world. Just greed. Avaricious greed. But the Indians have a principle that if I have a horse and I benefit from having that horse, then it behooves me to give to the poorest in my nation that doesn't have a horse, because it benefits them and ultimately it'll benefit me. Wow. So, the history of America, I will continue to highlight those things that I think people should know. I never get upset when people either don't acknowledge, or there's people who won't watch the podcast, people who won't buy the book. See, I lose nothing by that. If you understand, because I know this stuff. I make sure I'm passing it off to my generations. And I dare say that 7 generations of the Paden family have had sustainability by the works of Harry Paden. And for that, I pat myself on the back, because I patterned myself unknowingly after the Iroquois people. I certainly didn't pattern myself after the colonists who came and discovered people who were already here and ruling themselves. Do your own research. Again, H, the letter H, Congress Resolution 331. Our Constitution is almost line for line, word for word, preamble from preamble, based on the Iroquois' magnificent Iroquois Confederacy Constitution. Wow. This is stuff they want to teach you in school. That's why I love my book. I just love it. Because I wrote about this stuff for years in newspapers, told my church, told anybody that would listen. But now it's available. I don't have to shout it into the wind because now it's available. And it's available on Amazon.com, Harry Paden, the author. I got a couple of books out. But I love it. Now you tell me, history/facts not taught in schools, in most schools anyway. And it's the subtitle, Break the Chains, Knowledge is Power, by the greatest writer that I know, Harry Paden. That guy. You know how I am. I'm a fool, but I'm such an intelligent fool. To God be the glory. I hope this gives you some knowledge. Explore for yourself. Because when you're around the other people and they start espousing and talking and, being such intelligent people that they know everything and they think that we don't know anything except going flying through the air and playing basketball, running real fast and playing football, you can say, sir, did you know? And here's a backing it up. See, now what I can do is I can present my book. I know they so mad at me. If something happens to me, investigate, because the government doesn't like what I do. To God be the glory.